The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Let's talk about, so to set the stage, a lot of Donald Trump's cabinet has had problems with getting around on expensive airplanes and helicopter rides. And Ben Carson has a spending problem himself, but it's a different sort of spending problem because the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is run by Ben Carson, has agreed to spend $165,000 on lounge furniture for its Washington headquarters, in addition to $31,000 for a dining set purchased for the office of Housing Secretary Ben Carson. I wouldn't even know where to go to get a furniture that's this expensive. Oh, yeah. Like we know Mitchell Gold. Have you heard of Mitchell Gold, Bob Williams?
No.
So down on down kind of near Copley, there's a location for Mitchell Gold, Bob Williams, which is a really nice. They do really nice furniture.
Yeah, it's a nice area of Boston.
Based in North Carolina, a lot of different stores around the country. I've met Mitchell Gold before, and I visited his stores. Hell of a guy. Furniture's made in the U.S. and he really takes good care of his employees, et cetera. So the cost of the furniture is quite high compared to, I don't know, going to IKEA, right? Like a chair might be $700 or something like that. It's pretty expensive compared to IKEA. But where do you get a $31,000? Like, I wouldn't even know where to go.
They were saying, it's funny that you brought up chairs, because they were saying that $5,000 wasn't even enough for Ben Carson's chair.
For his office chair or something
and
like
one
that, right?
person who was working in the Housing and Urban Development Department pointed that out to a federal watchdog, and she was demoted for saying that.
For pointing out that they need more than the $5,000.
Yeah.
That's absolutely insane. And the Trump administration, on the one hand, is trying to cut HUD's annual budget by about 14%. And meanwhile, although that money would come out of programs meant to help poor and homeless Americans, Ben Carson can still get his $5,000 chair and his $31,000 dining set and $168,000 worth of, it's basically glorified patio furniture.
Yeah, I think it's even more egregious than the airfare costs in a way, because if you talk about like Scott Pruitt or Mnuchin spending way too much, at least they run like the EPA and the Treasury Department. So there's no clear contradiction there, taking money from people who would otherwise benefit from it. Whereas when you talk about, I know, but when you talk about housing and urban development, it's meant to help poor people specifically. So the fact that you're setting up some fancy office, I think that's a little bit more offensive to me.
It's more offensive, but I would still argue that any money that the EPA spends on travel for Scott Pruitt is money that's not spent, like on regulating, for example, which does hurt people. I get what you're saying.
There's a more clear connection.
It's a little clearer. Yeah, it's a little bit clearer. So ultimately what's going to happen, who knows? I mean, it's like with all these people, I think it's disgusting, but I try not to get super worked up because it's just like, this is what they do. They get into office. They spend a ton of money on all this stuff. They take advantage of taxpayer money. It's absolutely horrible, but I think there's sort of like higher level issues with how politics is financed. So I'm not underplaying the importance of this. It's absolutely vile, right? $31,000 for a dining table when the average, salary in the United States is not that much more than that.
Yeah.
But it's just like there are bigger fish to fry at the same time. I don't know.
Maybe Ben Carson's trying to get fired here, because remember, after Trump won the presidency, Carson said he wasn't qualified to be a cabinet secretary, which is funny because he wanted to be president himself.
Yes.
So maybe he didn't want this position in the first place, and this is his way out.
By buying a $31,000. Listen, I think if Carson wants out, there's quicker paths to the exits than buying a $31,000 dining set. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, maybe subconsciously Carson wants out.
You're just not thinking like a neurosurgeon. You got to think like a neurosurgeon.
That's
or a
sure.
motivational speaker.
One of the two, yeah. Or a spokesperson for pseudoscience herbs and supplements and stuff like that. Magic mushrooms. When we talk about evolution, what is the evolutionary basis for magic mushrooms, which are also known as shrooms, which are also known as what? Hallucinogenic mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms? Yeah, I don't know. A lot of names for them. They have passed their genes as a survival mechanism, because when you so how it works, the idea of how it works is, if you are, imagine being a magic mushroom. Imagine that for a second. Put yourself into the mind of a magic mushroom. If an insect comes up and starts to eat you, and they start, quote, tripping balls, as the phrase often goes, that will make the bugs less hungry and less likely to go and try to eat you in the future. So that's the idea that is being presented as to the evolutionary basis for Darwinian evolution and natural selection of mushrooms that cause a hallucinogenic response from consumption. That's pretty interesting.
That's interesting, yeah, because imagine now that you're a plant.
Yes.
You want animals to eat you. Not all in all cases, but say you're a fruit. You want the animal to come along, eat you. That way, it'll poop out your seed in another location, and you can spread. But because mushrooms are fungi, they spread through their spores, right? And that can just be carried through the wind and by animals too. But they don't want animals to eat them, I guess.
I guess not.
I guess not. Yeah.
I guess not. They prefer that animals not eat them. Now that sounds like sentience to me. I don't know that it's okay to eat mushrooms because
they're not plants.
They're not plants.
I eat a plant-based diet, but every now and then I'll cheat and have a plant and fungus-based diet. I'll have
exactly
yeast
right.
Or I'll mushrooms. So I don't know if that's fully vegan.
No, I'm not sure that it is, and a lot of it you can just pull right from the recesses of your hamper, which is super useful if you're looking for a quick pick-me-up. Listen, I actually do think, increasingly, I think that there are going to be questions about, I'm not talking about mushrooms now, which as you mentioned are fungi, but there are plants that when they are, quote, attacked, they will sort of sound an alarm that can be communicated to other plants of the same species in the area. To me, that seems like the same level of sentience as bivalves, or scallops, and I forget which other seafood, ocean life, I don't know what to call it, are bivalves. And I think the more we learn about the mechanisms and sort of the, I don't know if the neurology of plants is correct, but sort of like the nerve, I don't know what to call it. I think that there's going to be a blurry line. I think it's going to be a spectrum of sentience. I don't think it's as simple as plants and animals, flora and fauna. I think that there's going to be this gray area of some plants and some animals, I guess is what we're calling, that are going to have similar degrees of sentience.
So do you think there'll be more clear contradictions in the vegan lifestyle then? Like, what are the implications of knowing that?
I think that I mean, my guess is that most vegans won't be super impacted by it. They'll just be like, I'm still not, I don't care. Even if you find a particular plant that appears to have more sentience than a scallop, for example. I'm not even eating the scallop and I'm still eating the plant. But I think for the sort of, when we talk about the battle of ideas, to go back to a segment from earlier this week, I think when talking about sort of the principles around species sentience, I think it'll create some interesting conversations.
We've talked about this before, but my whole take is that if we do find out that these plants feel pain and are suffering and sentient, you still want to go for a plant-based diet, because in order to raise livestock, those cows and pigs, these big animals, live exclusively off of plants. And in order to get them to their size, you have to feed them a whole bunch of plants. Whereas if you go directly just from plants to humans, you don't need as many plants. And obviously we have to live off of something. So I think the solution to that, in that case, would still be to eat plants.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, I think for a lot of vegans, it won't change anything. But I think the principles underlying some of these decisions that people make will sort of become more complex as we learn more about the biology of some of the simplest animal foods and the more complex plant foods. And I welcome the discussion. I mean,
certainly if you're trying to argue a certain point, you want to remain consistent. So if there are blurry lines when it comes to feeling pain or sentience and these lines that vegans and vegetarians draw, I think that would be an interesting development. That's for sure.
I wonder if it would make it more likely that individuals would start eating the bivalves or not eating the plants that seem to have the mechanisms of response that are similar to those of the simplest animals. I don't know the answer to that. Hey, the Satanist, is it the Satanic Temple? Satanist? I know that there's two. There's the Church of Satan, and no, I'm talking about the Satanic Temple.
Okay.
Not the Church of Satan. Yeah, there's two. The Satanic Temple has made a very interesting habit that I actually support of filing lawsuits anytime they are not allowed to do an invocation or lead some kind of prayer in a public setting where typically a Christian or Judeo-Christian type invocation or prayer is allowed. And now there is a lawsuit filed by the Satanic Temple in Phoenix, Arizona, where the Satanists wanted to do an invocation at a city council meeting, because invocations were typically done at these meetings, just kind of like your basic sort of Christian,
it's like a call to prayer kind of
call
thing.
to prayer. Yeah, I don't
Before they start
even know what to
everything.
call it, but yeah, like
Yeah.
a call to prayer, I guess. It sounds crazy to say that, but that's basically what it is. And they were not allowed. They were told it was going to be absurd and that it would be, quote, taking equality too far. And of course, you either have equality or you don't have equality, but the idea of taking equality too far when it comes to religion in the public sphere is kind of absurd. And the Satanists are now filing a lawsuit, and I completely support and favor this type of lawsuit to expose, not because I want satanic invocations at public meetings, but to expose the hypocrisy.
Well, that's the thing. Like, are these Satanists being serious? Do they actually worship Satan? I know
This
there's
is,
the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster,
Yeah.
and it's comprised of atheists, and they're, satirically trying to point out the inconsistencies in our legal system
Yep.
and where separation of church and state isn't always held up.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like they're faking it.
I don't
to make
care.
That political
I don't
point.
think
I don't
it
know
matters.
if the Satanists are.
There's oftentimes, and we've interviewed individuals from the Satanic Temple. They don't seem to distinguish between the satire has no bearing on the legality and sort of equal protection. So I actually, I don't think it matters, because
just
whether
wonder,
it's
like,
for,
do they actually believe in this
it's
stuff or
interesting.
what?
A lot of them do, because they actually have tenets, and it's not about worshiping Satan per se. There are Satanic Temple tenets that don't really relate to Satan in any way, and they're actually pretty interesting humanist type principles in a lot of ways. But whether it's superstition or devout religious belief or dogma or fear of hell or satire, you either have equality under the law for all religions or you don't. And that's why I think that this is just so great.
Yeah, I mean, just get these prayers out of these city council meetings
Get 'em out, yeah.
altogether. What are they doing there? We have
Absolutely.
separation of church and state. You're free to practice your own religion in your own time, but not in front of the government.
I
not
completely agree.
not representing the government.
That's, I mean, I don't know. I think it's going to take more than a couple lawsuits from the Satanic Temple to end invocations at all government meetings.
It makes
But
people think.
I think it does make people think, and I think this is a good thing. And we'll see what ultimately happens with the lawsuit, because I actually think that the result of the lawsuit, that can serve as precedent. And I think that if the results are such that it suggests to other religious minorities, and say Satanists are a religious minority, if it suggests to them that they should be doing this elsewhere, you could immediately clog up the entire justice system with these lawsuits, and the precedent could go a long way here.
One-off comment here. Do you think Satanists are kinky? I always get that sense. Maybe
I
I'm
have no idea.
casting aspersions.
I think you're casting asparagus as
Aspersions on asparagus?
Aspersions on asparagus, as Louis Gomer said. I have no idea. I really couldn't tell you, but I'm sure by tomorrow at this time you'll have an answer from people in our audience. That's it for the bonus show. Talk to you tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.